My name is Jason Unruhe, the Maoist rebel. We've been sabotaged by those attempting to derail the upgraded message of MRN. We are not the Vanguard, but MRN is run on Vanguard rules. MRN is the media representative of the United Intercommunalist Convergence. United Intercommunalist Convergence is a united front of Demarchists, Third Worldists, Anarchists, and Maoists. I had plans to put out a video by Comrade Shabazz X, where he talks about the Demarchist organization known as Black Nation. After that, I was going to upload the video by Comrade Psy, where he talks about the Demarchist organization known as the Byzantine Catholic Nation. Then I was going to upload my documentary on Maoism, which I have had to redo more than once. Finally, I will upload my Third Worldist documentary. Sabotaged by populists has been a non-stop issue. Here's what we have so far. My sidekick is Maxwell Glover. When you think of a sidekick, you should think of Cato, not Robin. Cato was a mechanic, cook, bodyguard. Robin was just a yes man. I'm not looking for a yes man. Dark Synovia is no longer mid-rank, he is now front guard. Rear guard members of MRN are tasked with archiving, distributing, and fact-checking. Myself, Luke Dublin, the Falcon General, Maxwell Glover are all rear guard. The responsibility of the rear guard is to hold the line of those we are trying to platform. Luke Dublin is my successor, the Engelsist. When the day comes for Luke to take over for me, he will need a sidekick too. Luke Dublin's sidekick will be the Falcon General. MRN is not the boss of United Intercommunalist Convergence. The United Intercommunalist Convergence is the boss of MRN. To reinforce this, I will say what I have said before with more detail. I am the Maoist rebel. I started MRN. When the Maoist rebel steps down, the Engelsist will take over MRN. MRN no longer solely belongs to the Maoist rebel. The Falcon General is the face of MRN youth, just as the Maoist rebel is the face of MRN. When the Falcon General is too old to represent the MRN youth, she will choose a successor based on merits and trust. So when Luke steps into my role, Falcon will step into Maxwell's role. From there, Maxwell will decide with the others what role he should have in MRN. The only one who can override Maxwell Glover is Dark Synovia. The only one who can override Luke and Falcon is Stoned, the lumpen Third Worldist. The process is still being organized.
Hi everyone, so I'm back with another video. Apparently the webcam on my computer is actually dog shit quality, and my face camera side on my phone is better than that. So we're back to the phone, and today's essay is about colonialism, ethnic conflict, and resistance. Kind of a comparative case between Mexico and India. So here we go. Although culturally unique and on the opposite ends of the globe, India and Mexico share a few common experiences. Being a home to great ancient civilizations, being colonized by outside powers, being third world countries, having national liberation movements, experiencing economic exploitation under neoliberal policies, and, as we will be studying in this case, ethnic turmoil between different groups of people within each country. In India, this is marked by ongoing conflict between Muslims and Hindus, as well as Sikhs and other smaller ethnic minorities. In Mexico, this takes the form of conflict between indigenous people and the people of Spanish or Latin descent, as well as between Mexicans and people from Central and South America. In both countries, the situation is complicated and messy, made worse by poverty, imperialism, and a class divide. Because of this, the best solution for resolving conflict between ethnic or religious groups would have to address underlying cultural prejudices on a base level and use a strong rule of law to enforce these changes. The underlying cause of the contradictions must first be addressed. Then, dedicated action is required to keep progress moving in the right direction. So on India, India was once described by Marx as, quote, a country not only divided between Mohammedan, or Muslim as we say now, and Hindu, but also between tribe and tribe, between caste and caste. A society whose framework was based on a sort of equilibrium resulting from a general repulsion and constitutional exclusiveness between all of its members. End of quote. Indeed, India is currently and historically one of the most unequal and divided places on earth. Yet they also have a clear sense of nationalism and identity. When discussing India and these topics, it is impossible not to mention colonization and the role in British imperialist rule played into these factors. In many ways, India's modern image has been shaped by this legacy. Although India was ruled by other foreign powers before, European industrial capital rule was on a totally different scale than that of Asiatic warlords and emperors that had ruled in India's past. Along with the usual subjugation and exploitation, discrimination that normally comes with imperial rule, quote, British administrators then stratified ethnic groups by enforcing policies that benefited high castes but discriminated against low castes and tribals. High castes such as the Jainis in Malabar, for example, gained a new proprietary right over the land, while low castes and Adivasis, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but in the region suddenly became tenants at will. End of quote. That's from Verghese, 2016. This gave those who already had social power even more economic power under the British rule. Although the British tried to maintain religious and ethnic neutrality, they would partition different areas into separate regions for certain religious groups, such as Bangladesh in 1905. This was done under the pretense of settling conflict between Indians. However, it was more of a divide and conquer tactic, pitting Muslims and Hindus against each other so that the struggle against the colonial occupiers was reduced. This legacy would endure after Mahatma Gandhi led his nonviolent revolution to seek independence. While some Muslims were against Gandhi's vision for a unified India, it was actually a Hindu nationalist who killed the leader. Following this, India was led by Jawaharlal Nehru, head of India's National Congress, who embraced a policy of secularism, built up India on a mixed economy, and helped form the non-aligned movement alongside Indonesia and Tito's Yugoslavia. In the following decades after the death of Nehru, the National Congress was the undisputed dominant party in Indian politics, but by the 1990s, the movement had run out of steam. Some suggest that the success of the Indian National Congress was only a result of their independence movement and their association with the charismatic leadership of Gandhi. As the years went on, Hindu and Muslim nationalism grew in strength and conflicts intensified. Coming into the 21st century, nationalism and ethnic conflict took new forms. The BJP, now the ruling party of India, has become much more powerful, advocating and implementing policies that favored Hindu citizens, as well as with a more neoliberal economic model. Some attribute this trend with a rise in violence between Hindus and Muslims. In rural areas of the country, Maoist and other communist parties held and still do hold control and implement further land reform and progressive initiatives that were to the benefit of smaller ethnic groups and lower caste people. And it's actually interesting, I don't have the actual data on it here, but some of the areas that are occupied by these communist or Maoist groups are actually having higher living standards than other parts in the country based off of the microcosm of their rule there. So they're actually improving the conditions, but they're still in contradiction and conflict with the government. Sorry, where was I? Yeah, it said right here. Some of these areas are still in small-scale conflict with the Indian government. As a general trend, it is true that the violence in most of India's trouble spots has been on the decline, yet religion, caste, and ethnicity still play an important, sometimes cohesive role in what is supposed to be the world's largest democracy, bourgeois democracy. And the rise of the BJP begins to look more and more like Hindu centrism or even Hindu theocracy. So, on to Mexico. In the case of Mexico, it was formally colonized much earlier, starting in 1519 by the Spanish. Like India, the colonizers utilized existing contradictions between the people for their own gain. This time, it was the Aztec code of social hierarchy that the Spaniards rigidly enforced, combined with their own European racialism. As a result of merchants visiting the New World, as they called it, Spanish troops coming and going, and the slave trade, Mexico became a relatively ethnic diverse land, including African and Caribbean people, Latin Europeans, and indigenous Mexica people. Again, similar to India, proto-capitalist colonial economic relations were implemented, particularly in land ownership, which became concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer wealthier elites, who were mainly Latin European, often employing indigenous people in the fields under forced labor or indentured servitude. Like many countries in the Americas, Christianity, in this case the Roman Catholic Church, played a tremendous role in colonization in the recent history. This has had a mixed effect on the region's development, on the one hand being a reminder of the colonial legacy and opposing progressive reforms like increased women's rights and gay liberation, while on the other hand offering a sense of community for people, advocating charity, and being the inspiration for liberation theology movements like the Sandinistas, or in the case of Mexico, the Zapatistas, eventually providing a platform for those same progressive reforms the reactionary church officials once opposed. So, and this is another side point, but again, as Western Marxists and communists, we shouldn't outright dismiss religious-based revolution. It might not be dialectical, it might not be scientific, but if it has the support of the deep roots of the people, then it's not something that we should be ignored. It should be investigated and looked into. Mexico gained its independence in 1821, but it was eventually overtaken by a Bonapartist-type dictatorship. This occurred after a year of instability in the country, followed by an American invasion and annexation of what is now Texas and parts of America's southwest, like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California. Under the following rule of the new dictator Diaz, he sold out much of his country's infrastructure to foreign capitalists and companies, many from the United States. And while the country saw economic growth, the country's working class faced harsh conditions, low wages, and were prohibited from forming unions. By 1910, there was dissatisfaction towards the Diaz regime for various reasons and from different groups within Mexico. Laborers and peasants for the obvious aforementioned reasons, middle-class liberals who were dissatisfied with the lack of freedom, and Mexico's own national bourgeois who were opposed to foreign control of enterprise. It was this diverse group of interests that would influence the revolution, as well as develop into populism and show its weakness later on. After Diaz was thrown out, there was a struggle for power among the various factions of radical and reformist revolutionaries in Mexico. Although on shaky foundations, decades of positive reform followed, including the secularization of education, the nationalization of much of the economy, and other such reforms. Eventually, similar to India, Mexico had its own dominant party state, theirs being the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party, or PRI, as they call it there. In the 1980s, under the pressures of debt, the World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. government, Mexico and the PRI began to introduce economic privatization, defunding of public services, and deregulation of the market. The culmination of this was the ratification of the NAFTA deal, which basically screws over Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico, mostly Mexico, for the benefit of the United States profits. Because of these policies, inequality soared, foreign products flooded the market, and immigration to the United States grew. In the view of some, this would lead to the Mexican government acting in collaboration with the U.S. on immigration and border policy, shifting the blame of the immigration crisis, as they say, onto those who further south who were also trying to enter the United States, such as people from Guatemala, whose people would become stigmatized and discriminated against in Mexico, which is something a lot of people don't know. Around the same time that economic changes were fully realized, the Zapatistas, armed anarchist revolutionaries among the rural and indigenous peasantry, rose up and declared something of an autonomous zone in the Chiapas region. For many other indigenous peoples in Mexico, the Zapatistas served as a symbol of national awakening, a call to those people who were oppressed by colonialism and then, later on, neoliberalism. It also highlighted the importance of indigenous heritage, where other socialist and Marxist movements before them had either not understood or, out of Eurocentrism, ignored this aspect of the Mexican Revolution. Although the Zapatistas eventually entered into a peace treaty with the government, they are still active in Chiapas. In the 2000s, the hegemony this is later on. Into the 2000s, the hegemony of the PRI was weakened by the new right-wing PAN party. However, crime, corruption, the drug trade, human trafficking all increased during this period as well. And I'll be putting all the sources in the description, so if you're interested, you can do further readings on all these things. Even though Mexico now has a new president from a separate political party, the stability of the country's leadership is still up for question. Today, Mexico remains a complicated place, and the country's 56 different indigenous groups, who historically and currently make up a large portion of the country's rural peasantry, are now in different stages of emancipation and or cooperation with the government, with some being granted and others taking for themselves the autonomous lands of their ancestors. So it can be argued that India and Mexico's experiences with ethnic clashes and indigenous struggles are a result primarily of three things: a history of colonialism, a present of neoliberal capitalism, and the presence of contradictions between different people within the country on an ethnic level. The latter is not directly caused by the former, but imperialist colonialism and monopoly capitalism have made these contradictions more acute. Therefore, the solution must address all these issues through both healing the broken cultural ties between people, as well as combating policy factors that accentuate these problems. A threefold program of decolonization, socialism, and intercommunal dialogue must be sought out. Thank you for listening. Cheers, comrades.
There's some confusion around the Marxian usage of the term Third Worldism. There's also a confusion around Mao versus Mao Zedong thought versus Marxism, Leninism, Maoism versus Maoism, Third Worldism. So let me clarify. Mao Zedong was a great man with great ideas. He betrayed the very revolution he started when he met with Nixon, but he would not meet with Huey. Mao Zedong also screwed up things when he wrote the reactionary Three Worlds theory. Mao Zedong thought was the most revolutionary tendency of Marxism-Leninism for its time. This was the first inspiration and even a key pillar of the world revolution. Maoism is a continuity and rupture within Marxism-Leninism. This third stage of Marxism was started by Lin Biao in the original Black Panther Party. The word Maoism was a very empty distinction before Gonzalo wrote his formalized notions of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Marxism, Leninism, Maoism was first declared in the 1980s by Gonzalo, then unanimously by all of the Revolutionary Internationalist movement in 1993. Before this, there had been many types of Maoists. Maoists in name only, Maoists in practice, but not in name, and the very rare exception, Maoists in both practice and name. Maoism Third Worldism is short for Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Third Worldism. That is a very long-winded, so it's easier to say Maoism, Third Worldism. But there are MLM out there who only see Third Worldism as a study of the global class divide. Then there is the Third Worldist tendency of the MLMs. The Falcon General, the Engelsist, the Black Internationalists are all MLM of the Third Worldist tendency. But Falcon General is of two tendency, Third Worldist tendency and the principally Maoist tendency. The Gonzaloist First Worldist Red Guards are not principally Maoist at all, and outside of Peru, Gonzalo thought makes no sense at all. If you want to know who I answer to, it is the street cadres. This means if the Black Internationalists came to me ordering me to do a video on lumpen black LGBTQ or third world issues, and I would be obligated to do so. Speaking of such, I wish to clarify that I speak in vulgarizations. I can be very dialectical, but when I do so, I run the risk of sounding too much like an elitist. When I say identity politics or ID poll, I am talking about the weaponization of reactionary and or wealthy persons weaponizing their intersectional plights against the poor, who are typically not from such intersectional grouping. I think the PC word for this is identity reductionism or identity opportunism. When I say intersectionality, I am talking about reactionary intercommunalism. Now, as for anarchists, what they say about identity politics intersectionality is up to them. The Maoist rebel is not here to control the anarchists. If I need to be more PC about the words identity politics and intersectionality, I will accept a rebuke from the black internationalist, and only her. MRN is not a friend of gender warriors. MRN is a friend of trans people. MRN is no friend to Zionists. MRN is a friend to the Jewish community. MRN is no friend to Whitey. MRN is a friend to the European thought throughout, Europeans throughout. The world that understands that they need to shed their whiteness. MRN views transness as culture and is still evolving. As most of us cis males, it is for trans people to explain transness. Yes, trans is a part of the culture. MRN is not a gatekeeping platform. But if others think they can keep from fucking with my friend Falcone, they are in for a surprise. This is a video by the PBS NewsHour, which came out on the date of August 24th, 2011.
It's August on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in western South Dakota, and the annual powwow is in full swing. The celebration is a highlight for the Oglala Sioux tribe, bringing together thousands of Native Americans to sing, dance, and honor their traditional culture. Tonight's good cheer, however, is in stark contrast to everyday life in one of the most difficult places to live in the United States. Few people in the Western Hemisphere have shorter life expectancies. Males on average live to just 48 years old. Females to 52. Almost half of all people above the age of 40 have diabetes, and the economic realities are even worse. Unemployment rates are consistently above 80%. In Shannon County, inside the Pine Ridge Reservation, half the children live in poverty, and the average income is $8,000 a year. But there are funds available, a federal pot now worth more than $1 billion. That sits here in the U.S. Treasury Department waiting to be collected by 9 Sioux tribes. The money stems from a 1980 Supreme Court ruling that set aside $105 million to compensate the Sioux for the taking of the Black Hills in 1877. They're an isolated mountain range rich in minerals that stretch from South Dakota to Wyoming. The only problem, the Sioux never wanted the money, because the land was never for sale.
The Black Hills are very important to the Sioux Indian tribes because they are the spiritual center of Sioux people.
For tribal attorney Mario Gonzalez, the compensation fund is the embodiment of Indian mistreatment by the U.S. government, and the taking of the Black Hills was the gravest sin of all.
The Sioux tribes have always maintained that that confiscation is illegal and that the tribes must have some of their ancestral lands returned to them.
Compared to the natural resource-rich Black Hills, the reservations the Sioux were relegated to are mostly dry, desolate landscapes. Shannon County has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the United States.
At one time, the Sioux Indians were a wealthy people, and they had, a place here that satisfied all their needs.
The land dispute dates back to 1868, when the U.S. signed a treaty at Fort Laramie that set aside the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. But when gold was discovered in the hills a few years later, the floodgates opened and Western pioneers poured in, and the Fort Laramie Treaty was broken.
There's a long history of treaties having been made with Indian tribes that were broken. Some would say that no treaty was ever kept with an Indian tribe.
Ross Swimmer served as a special trustee for American Indians during the George W. Bush administration.
It's been a psychological issue for all the Sioux tribes all this time, and much of that land is still owned by the federal government. And so the tribes are simply saying, well, wait a minute, you took our land, we want the land back.
From 2003 to 2009, Swimmer oversaw the Black Hills Trust account, one that grew substantially from the initial $105 million settlement.
Tribal monies invested have to be in basically government securities or better, where there's no danger of loss. 30 years later, it's worth $1 billion, so it's not a bad return.
But the Sioux say that money is far less than what the land is worth. The Black Hills are a major draw for tourists, helping to promote an industry that generates over $2 billion of economic activity every year for the state of South Dakota. And there are still questions on the best way to distribute the $1 billion. Any compensation money for the Sioux would mainly be distributed on a per capita basis.
If you've got 100,000 Sioux and $1 billion, you're talking about 10,000 apiece or something. That goes pretty fast.
That type of plan is totally unacceptable to the Sioux tribes, because when you give out per capita payments, the money is gone in a year or two, and then the tribes still end up with nothing to show for their ancestral lands.
After more than 130 years of standoff over what the U.S. government owes the Sioux, President Obama's election to office appeared to provide an opening.
I'm absolutely committed to moving forward with you and forging a new and better future together.
The president said he would meet with the Sioux tribes on the Black Hills land claim, the first to do so. Obama said the 9 tribes must first agree unanimously on a proposal among themselves. That is a problem, says Native American journalist Tim Giago, who has covered this story for more than 30 years.
We got a lot of infighting, a lot of squabbling amongst our own people. There have been meetings taking place in the past year and a half, 2 years on the different reservation in which a lot of the people are coming together, and they're sitting down and actually discussing the whole prospects about where we're going to go.
Teresa Tubles is a former Oglala Sioux president who helped organize the efforts to restart the Black Hills talks following Obama's 2008 election. She agrees with Giago that there are serious divisions, but says that the tribes are making progress.
This is the closest we've gotten. And believe me, it's hard to unite people. You know, it's hard to stay positive, but you have to. I'm tired of this poverty, tired of this rut that we live in.
Gonzalez says the tribes have formed a reparations alliance and are aiming to finalize a proposal to be submitted to Congress by the end of the year. He hopes that proposal will give the Sioux shared ownership of over 1 million acres of federal land within the Black Hills, along with financial compensation. But he quickly points out that the Sioux are not seeking any private property and knows that popular tourism attractions will be off the table.
The tribes are trying to be realistic. When the Sioux tribes are asking that all the federal lands be returned to them, that does not include Mount Rushmore, post offices, or any property that is being used by the government for governmental purposes.
And what Gonzalez and the Sioux are asking for does have precedent. President Nixon returned nearly 50,000 acres of federal lands in the Carson National Forest in New Mexico to the Taos Pueblo tribe in 1970. And although recent polls show the younger generation of the Sioux more willing to accept the Black Hills money, some of the poorest people in the country have thus far remained steadfast in their opposition to taking it.
It's a tough group up there. You know, I'm amazed that they have been willing to sit on the money, so to speak, this long without, taking the money.
We accept the money, then we don't have the treaty obligations that the federal government has with us for taking our land, for taking our gold, all our resources out of the Black Hills.
Sioux leaders say they will take up the Black Hills issue again at tribal meetings in the coming months.
And now I give you Luke Dublin, the Engelsist.
Hello, this is Luke Dublin, the Engelsist. So I turn you over to what was said by Dr. Abraham Weisfeld of the Bundist movement, of which the chairman is also the chairman of the revolution. This is the Pantherite Antifa Intercommunal United Front. We who are Democist, Marxist, or anarchist declare that Dr. Abraham Weisfeld is the chairman of the United Intercommunalist Convergence, which I am a part of. I will read you something written by our Jewish democrat friend Dr. Weisfeld, who has taken a bullet for Palestinians and got tortured by Israeli Zionists, and he is a Jewish anti-Zionist. When the meat cleaver was thrown at the Capitol police officer during the fascist insurrection of January the 6th, 2021, the point of no return was launched. While this amateur act of counter-revolution was directed against the state for causing the opposing temerity of holding an election to replace the chosen king of Christendom, this became the point in which what was recognized that the balance of forces had been reversed. No longer were European Christians of German extraction together with Anglo-American supremacists in a majority. It was evident that it would never be again, both because of immigration and the rise of minorities' educational integration. Caste, order, and civil society in the United States is a permanent revolutionary feature of society to come. The driving force of national identity is being exposed, countered the force of fascist repression of Black Americans, who have taken control of public spaces and streets in America, together with the mobilization of supporters, such as the revolutionary elements of the national minorities of indigenous First Nations, the Machika, and the Jewish nations, with the recognition that the revolt of millions of younger generational activists in Black Lives Matter, together with Black Bloc Antifa, the racist core of America, came out to defend their chosen Messiah, King and Führer. This failure of an act is a desperation that illustrates the lack of support, even amongst the precious supporters of the Trumpist movement. This desperation has exposed the populism as a failure to answer the cries that spawned its movement. The pathetic yet successful coup on the Capitol building was not a force in itself, but rather was facilitated by the refusal of the military Pentagon command, which refused the positioning of National Guard when it stated intention it was a matter of common knowledge. The infiltration of the military and police forces by fascist elements organized in its source is the problem. Where does that leave us in the Jewish socialist movement, which have emerged from the ashes of history to present a program necessary to provide an alternative to the racist nation state in both the US and Palestine? We are able to form a united front by way of the concept of national cultural autonomy, whereby no national formation controls any other than itself. This communalist convergence is beyond political doctrine of liberal electoral politics, beyond the Leninist party mini-state formation that seeks to replace the dictatorship of one class by that of another, by means of the party padagram. It is rather the state itself which is put into question and is thus undetermined by the rejection of the nation state, with the negation of the nation state itself and on behalf of civil society. This was originally uploaded March 14th, 2021. These are the words of Dr. Abraham Weisfeld. This has been the Engelsist, the Maoist rebel, of Maoist Rebel News. Never again.
Hello, here I am. Now, I'm going to be speaking to you today about a recent chapter that has been written for the Manual of Revolution produced by the Jewish Bundesdiaspora movement, of which I am the revolutionary chairman. And I have called this chapter Cleavage Points, subtitled Social Orders and Class. And there has to be a differentiation made, first of all, between social orders and what has been called in classical Marxism economic orders. Now, most people are familiar with the economic orders such as slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. These are economic orders. And they are presented in classical Marxist theory as being a linear progression in historical development. This is called historical materialism, from a materialist methodology of a classical scientific method. However, as should be known, in 1905 there was a Einsteinian revolution which did away with classical scientific method of the linear progression, such as this. This is also called periodization. And the problem being that it just, doesn't happen like that, in reality. The actuality of the situation, as exemplified in the 1917 Russian Revolution, is that the stage of the capitalist economic order was overcome or bypassed or whatever, as it is postulated in the theory of the permanent revolution, which was a theory developed, from the 19th century on through until it became codified, by the experience of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolshevik Party came over to adopt the socialist program rather than the Menshevik program of sustaining the capitalist bourgeois liberal state in its development of a capitalist order, in spite of it being a socialist organization. So, social orders are what is often thought of as caste orders, or the caste system, as in feudalism, where there was castes, in which the family into which you were born remained the economic order to which you were assigned, in terms of being either a slave or peasant or aristocrat, with the landed property owners on a permanent basis. In India, we still have such a caste order, as exemplified in the differentiation made between the biological origins of various nationalities within India. Now, social orders are yet again different. And we have to step outside of classical Marxism in order to theorize about social orders. And it is necessary to do so because we have social orders which persist in the advanced capitalist nation states of Europe, North America, South America, and as the nation state is propagated in the Orient as well by imperialist intervention, in particular the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1922, which divided up the Western Orient, which is called the Near East or the Middle East, which are false colonialist projections. And those states that were carved up or carved into the Western Orient are now in full-blown crises, and will continue to do so until they found themselves as independent social entities, and not those entities dominated by a bourgeois class put into place by the colonialist system in what is called neo-colonialism. Okay, so now we're getting into the crux of the matter. Now, these social orders are what are oftentimes termed nationalities, because people of different national origins are confined, to given, economic and social space by social discrimination, by economic discrimination, which are generic to racism and anti-Semitism. Jewish people are a social order, although Jewish people have collectively helped themselves to advance in their collective economic foundation within the advanced capitalist states. Nonetheless, Jewish people remain identified and discriminated against and oppressed national minority within the capitalist Christian nation states. What this means is, for instance, the United States of America, you know, the devises, the money, you know, like is stamped with the words, you know, like, in God we trust. Now, which God do you think they're talking about? They're talking about the Christian God, which is called oftentimes the Lord, Jesus Christ. This, of course, is exclusionary to Jewish people. Since the time of the Roman Empire in 326, when Christianity was declared to be the state religion, and it was theorized as a doctrine, as Christian doctrine, when Christianity was founded at that time. And it was the Jewish people who were taken to be responsible for the crucifixion of Yehoshua ben Yusuf, otherwise known as Jesus Christ. Previously, you know, Christianity was a sect, a Jewish sect, that extolled Yehoshua ben Yusuf as a Messiah of one sort or another, even though he never wrote anything. And usually, you know, in Judaism, you know, like, Messiahs are supposed to write something, you know, in order to make their thought, you know, like systematic and perpetual. This was not the case with Yehoshua ben Yusuf, and that's why he was not considered to be a prophet by the Judaic culture, political culture. Now, Christianity, which was established only in 326 AD, or the Common Era, CE as we call it, changed the nature of the Jewish people to be a minority which was rejected as part of the hegemonic political culture. This has persisted and was embellished and into further stages of anti-Semitism, which then became the Christian doctrine of Nazism. And I say Christian doctrine of Nazism, you know, with intent, because there was no other way to describe, you know, Nazism other than a Christian political culture and a nation state, considering that it entered into a pact with the Vatican, was launched originally, you know, by Lutheranism, which denounced the Jewish people for not having converted to Lutheranism in Germany, in somewhat the same way that Muhammad denounced the Jewish people for not having converted to become Muslims under his messianic leadership. Although Nazism, you know, was qualitatively much more seriously, you know, a problem, because Nazism proposed the extermination, not merely the discrimination of the Jewish people. In Islam and Muslim cultures, the Jewish people were relegated to a dhimmi status, national minority of a social order codified in law, for which the Jewish people had to pay a particular tax for protection from the state, and excluded from military service, that is military training, which didn't allow for Jewish self-defense, of course. Now, in Nazism, the social order of the Jewish people was considered to be something to be excluded, not by transfer, not by exile, but by extermination. And Jewish people were not allowed to leave the Nazi nation state, and were scheduled for extermination as projected in the initial book of the Hitlerian regime, the Mein Kampf. It was not something developed later on. It was originally postulated, and in fact is a continuation of the various crusades which massacred the Jewish people of Germany and the Slavic countries, you know, when the Crusaders went on their way, you know, to capture the city of Jerusalem and proclaim themselves, you know, to be the leaders of the world, basically, as Jerusalem was considered to be the world center of political culture. So there are many reasons to recognize the Jewish people as a social order, and that is why the Jewish Socialist Bund calls for national cultural autonomy, and our movement was founded in 1897 in opposition to the Zionist movement, which sought to relieve the oppression of the Jewish people by leaving their cultural homelands, of Germany, Poland, whatever, give up on their nationality and giving up on integration, giving up on their civil rights, giving up on all of this, considering it to be an impossibility, and seeking to establish a similar nation state in a territory which was considered to be the possession of the Jewish people, contrary to Judaism. Judaism does not consider the Holy Land to be the possession of the Jewish people. For instance, in the Torah, what was later called the Old Testament by Christianity, the covenant with Abraham, denoted, the clan of Abraham to be welcome in the land of Canaan, and that the descendants of Abraham would be welcome there forever. Now, of course, the first son of Abraham was Ishmael, who was the father of the Arabic nations, and only the second son of Abraham was Isaac, and Isaac was later on included in this pact, so that both peoples were welcomed in permanence in the land of Canaan. Later on, there's an historical account in the Torah of how, this was transformed into a monarchy called the Eretz Yisrael and all this, even though the name Israel is the name of the Jewish people given to Jacob's son Joseph. And this was not to be considered, equivalent to the land of Canaan. And there were various nations that coexisted there in the various city-states in an autonomous fashion. And in fact, when even Joshua entered into the land of Canaan, supposedly with the aim of conquering it, this was dropped when there was actually a peace pact established with the Hittites, which was another of the nations living in the land of Canaan. And this peace pact allowed for the mutual coexistence of these nations within the same land. So there is no historical or Judaic basis, for the establishment of a nation state called Israel, which is actually a Zionist state. And that is all that it is. So, in order to provide an alternative to Zionism, the Jewish Bundist movement called for national cultural autonomy in which the Jewish people would have their security and self-reliance in conjunction with that of other peoples living within the same society. As a civil society becomes the dominant mode of existence rather than the state. In effect, civil society necessarily becomes independent of the state. And in fact, it is projected by the logical conclusion of Bundism, that civil society replaces the state. In order to do so, one must have a socialist revolution in order to overcome the domination of the class, the bourgeois class, which maintains the state, the bourgeois state, as a form of domination rather than liberation. Liberalism considers that it is the most advanced form of political existence, by postulating democracy. But the form of democracy presented by liberalism is majoritarian domination, which has been called in political theory the dictatorship of the majority. And this was meant, to dispute, the right of the working class, which was majoritarian in Europe at one point, and was objected to the domination of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it, in effect, abolished, the bourgeois class, which is, okay. However, the dictatorship of the proletariat also applies to the phenomenon where the Christian political culture, in its majority, considers that it has the right to dominate any other, minority nationality. And this is the problem. And this is why the Christian political culture coincides with the bourgeois nationalist political culture of state domination, and which is the reason why national minorities are oppressed. Now, in order to have a political culture of national cultural autonomy, the social order of the Jewish people, or in other cases, such as the Black Americans, must be granted their national rights. In the case of the black Americans, this can even be extended into territorial rights, where there is a majority of the black Americans who live in a particular territorial region and therefore can claim to territorial autonomy as well as national cultural autonomy. Now, to talk about black Americans is sort of a misnomer as well, because Americans are something that does not exist as a coherent and homogeneous, political culture, because there are so many different kinds of nationalities living in the United States. To start off with, 26% of the Americans are Anglo-Americans from the British colonial period. 25% are German immigrants who left Germany to find some land to own, and they came here in order to get free land that was stolen from the First Nations. And the German Americans left Germany because of the oppressive conditions there, and because of unemployment, etc., etc. And so 25% of Americans presently came from Germany, like Trump. And then we get into the occupied territories of Mexico, which contained a large, population of originally Spanish-speaking political culture, which were mesticized with the First Nations of Mexico to become Mexicas, and now presently forming 40% of the Californian population. So when you get real, the actuality of the American political culture, you see that it's much more diversified, than what it's projected to be. And there is no sort of homogeneous American, although there is a common American political culture. There are also other political cultures that exist amongst the various different nationalities. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So, in order to have national cultural autonomy, you cannot have a nation state. It's a contradiction. So what do you have? How do you change the country into being a truly democratic country in which every particular nationality has its own democratic rights and is not taken to be, something subordinate, to the majority political culture? In order to do so, national political economy must be founded within a federated society in which all the different national political economies come together and set up their society based upon mutual reciprocal respect. How do you do this? Well, there's a mechanism which was part of the American sort of revolution called the Constituent Assembly. Only there it was dominated by, slave owners, okay? Who nonetheless, were liberal Democrats, and wanted their political independence, for the sake of their own political ambitions and their economic ambitions, But the mechanism, which is more important than what they were, is the Constituent Assembly, and it is the fundamental mechanism by which any revolution has succeeded in the past. In particular, following the American Revolution, there was the Constituent Assembly of the French Revolution, in which the Third Estate, which was a economic class of peasants and workers, led by the middle class of professionals, overcame the second caste, which was the clergy, and the first caste, which was the landed aristocracy. So the first two castes were abolished, basically, in one way or another, basically by the guillotine. And the Third Estate set up its own liberal democratic regime, which was dominated by the rising bourgeoisie. And so the revolution was limited. And even though the Jacobins, took over and were starting to implement, a economic order which was post-feudal and post-capitalist, well, not post-capitalist, but, surmounting capitalism or overcoming the capitalist stage by setting up, a popular economic order. Nonetheless, the Thermidorian reaction reversed that revolution and made it into a limited bourgeois revolution with liberal democracy as a result. So the Paris Commune of 1871 tried to overcome this again, but it was repressed by the bourgeois military soldiers of Thiers, General Thiers, who were liberated by the victorious German regime, Prussian regime, which even offered, to send its own, military into France in order to defeat, the Paris Commune. But the bourgeois French order, led by General Thiers, refused, such aid and overcame the Paris Commune on its own and massacred everybody. So, how do we get, to a socialist revolution, recognizing, national cultural autonomy? Using a method tried and true of a constituent assembly. Well, all the movements, have to come together to form such a united front. United Front is the revolutionary vanguard that will establish a constituent assembly in order to codify the socialist revolution in terms of political rights and economic rights. So the economic rights of workers would have to be built into a constitution such as this, and not merely leaving constitution to decrypt and enunciate, various political rights, which suit, the bourgeois economic order alone. So, which is the case of what we are doing now. United Front is what we are forming up, between, in our own case, the Jewish, national cultural autonomy, together with, the Black National Liberation Front of Black and national cultural territorial autonomy, together with the liberation of the Mexicas, the First Nations, of course, which will have to be granted preferential rights in order to resuscitate its demographic order, since the First Nations in the United States, only comprise 1.5% of the population, because all the rest, have been massacred in genocidal practices, which can clearly be seen, in comparison, with Canada, where there was less of a genocidal practice, and which the First Nations comprise 5% of the population and not 1.5% of the population. Oh, I have an order here. Let me see what I can do about this. Okay, let's continue with this. So I've gone on quite long enough, for a simple video such as this. So I think that I've covered, the essential features of what it means to be talking about social orders, and what consequential, political program is required in order to deal with the interests of the various social orders. So, if I may, I would read to you excerpts from the chapter on social orders, and the first paragraph of the conclusion as well, in order to make this much more systematic elaboration. So the chapter is called Cleavage Points, subtitled Social Orders in Class. So, when the meat cleaver was thrown at the Capitol police officer during the fascist insurrection of January the 6th, 2021, the point of no return was launched. While this amateur act of counter-revolution was directed against the state for the cause of opposing the temerity of holding an election to replace the chosen king of Christendom, this is the point at which it is recognized that the balance of forces has been reversed. No longer were the European Christians of German extraction, together with the Anglo-American supremacists, no longer a majority. It was evident that it would never be again. Both because of immigration and the rise of educational integration, the caste order of the civil society in the United States of America was a permanent and revolutionary feature of the society to come. The driving force of national identity has exposed and countered the force of fascist repression, of the Black Americans who have taken control of the public spaces of American streets, together with the mobilization of such supporters from the revolutionary elements of the national minorities of the indigenous First Nations, the Mexica, and Jewish nations. With the recognition of this revolt of millions of younger generational activists of the Black Lives Matter, together with the Black Bloc and Antifa, the racist core of America came out to defend their chosen Messiah, King and Führer. The failure of this act of desperation illustrates the lack of support from amongst even the previous supporters of the Trumpist movement. The desperation has exposed the populism as the failure to answer the crises that have spawned its movement. The pathetic and yet successful coup into the Capitol building was not a force in itself, but was rather facilitated by the refusal of the military Pentagon Command, which refused the positioning of the National Guard when its stated intention was a matter of common knowledge. The infiltration of the military and police forces by the fascist elements and organizations is the source of the problem. It is the state infiltrated by the fascist elements that is the source of the problem. In conclusion, I would say this is sort of an envelopment of the whole critique of the bourgeois nation state, that I have mentioned. And it goes like this. By conclusion of the mutual recognition of nationalities as social formations in a federation based upon reciprocities rooted in symbiotic material and social relations with multiculturalism and consensus codified in the social constitution by way of the constituent assembly of the civil society as a whole, a truly social revolution is founded. Okay, let's get on with it. Thank you very much for your attention. This is Dr. Abraham Weisfeld speaking to you from Montreal, Quebec, which is an autonomous nation here in Canada, still seeking its national cultural autonomy, and looking forward to forming a federation of nationalities, not only in Canada and in the United States of America, but in North America, a new North America that is beyond either Canada or the United States of America.
What do you get when you include myself, Luke Dublin, and Falco in general? You get the Maoist Rebel Triad. We are the rear guard, press representatives, Mason's New America, as well as Dr. Weisfeld's idea of a new Quebec, are matters needing more discussion. Regardless, the USA, Canada, and the Zionist state have no right to exist.
Tormentas agitan los aires, nubes oscuras nos impiden ver, aunque nos espera el dolor y la muerte, contra el enemigo nos llama el deber, el bien más preciado